since I know there's a lot to talk about. So I'm Lucas Smith, and I will be talking about representations of queer identity in the opera Fellow Travelers by Gregory Spears and Greg Pierce. So this was also my dissertation topic, so there's mountains and mountains of information, and we only have a little bit of time to cover it. So excuse me if I kind of speed through things. So I do think it's important to at least have a basic framework for an overview of queer representation in opera before we get started. And then we'll talk about the specific opera, Fellow Travelers, the synopsis, its main characters, and then we'll get into the meat of the musical representation of the two lead characters in the opera. So firstly, queerness in opera, it can be divided into sort of three categories. The first period being before the 20th century, where essentially there's no explicit representation in the plots or in the characters of operas. However, there was a very strong social component to going to the opera, to meeting people, and within the queer community, that was very important. There's a couple quotes here that kind of outline some of that, and also the queer fandom, right? The idolization of the divas and what Wayne Kosterbaum calls a sort of displaced eroticism, where you can sort of see yourself in those heteronormative plots and play out some of your fantasies in that manner. The second period being the early 20th century, through about the mid 20th century, we have minor characters who are gay and coded representation. So this would be some of the minor characters that we might have seen, some of them explicitly gay in the operas, some are not. And then later here at the bottom we have some queer characters who are the lead characters, but who are not explicitly out in the opera. So like Peter Grimes, where we find out later through the scholarship of Philip Brett that actually, if we understand his character from a queer perspective, then a lot of the music that Benjamin Britten has written for him makes a lot more sense. The final period, which is the period that I'm going to focus on, is explicit representation in opera. Here, the characters are out, it's their stories, it's about them. And we see the first real big one with Lou Harrison, Young Caesar in '71, and then there's a bit of a lull, and in the last 20 years or so, we've had a real explosion of queer characters being represented in opera. You can see a list of some of them here. I'm sure I've missed a few. This is where Fellow Travelers falls, right? 2016 is Fellow Travelers, and the characters, as an audience, we do understand that they're queer characters. And I also want to just point out quickly that, as far as I can tell, I am the only one who has done theoretical research to this last group. Most of the research that's out there is in the coded representation category. So if anyone is interested in this topic and would like to tackle some of these other operas and how these queer characters are being musically represented, I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. So let's talk about Fellow Travelers. It was originally a book, a 2007 novel by Thomas Mallon, and in 2016 it was turned into an opera. So the story follows the gay romance of two State Department employees during the Lavender Scare of the McCarthy era in the 1950s America. So for those of us that might not be familiar with the Lavender Scare, it went alongside the Red Scare, but instead of people being interrogated for being communist and losing their jobs, they were interrogated for being gay, and they would lose their jobs if they were found to be homosexual. So the thought process here was that if you were gay, then you were clearly of low moral character, and you could be blackmailed by communists to tell government secrets. So actually more people lost their jobs because they were assumed of being gay during this period than because they were assumed of being communist. So the opera and the novel both touch on themes of religious trauma, internalized homophobia, secret love, and it does highlight that discrimination that the characters experienced. The opera follows the book pretty closely, but it does focus on that central love connection between the two main characters that we're going to talk about shortly. So as we know with opera, everything has to be pretty concise and has to be for the purpose of telling the story. So a lot of the fun anecdotes and historical commentary ended up getting sort of cut out. Although McCarthy does make an appearance in the opera briefly. So the main characters. Timothy Laughlin is the lead tenor. He's the idealistic young reporter, falls head over heels for Hawkins. Although he is a talented writer, he does often come off as nervous or awkward. And he is a devout Irish Catholic, which is important because he really struggles with his internalized homophobia and his feelings that his desire for the homosexual relationship is a mortal sin. And so he kind of goes back and forth, and he really embodies that struggle, and we'll see that in his music a little bit later. Hawkins Fuller, the baritone, more seasoned employee of the State Department. He enjoys being in control. He's excited by dangerous situations. He has really embraced his role as the handsome bachelor in the suit and tie who commands attention and sort of plays with everyone else's understanding of him. He wants other people to see him how he wants them to see him. And so really control is very important for him. And we'll see a little bit of that in his music as well. The third character is Mary Johnson. She's very important in the opera. However, we're not going to have time to talk about her today. She basically is a friend to both of the other two men, and she really becomes the moral compass of the show. She's really the only selfless character that we get. So, brief timeline of events. Act 1, Tim and Hawk, they meet in DuPont Circle. This was actually a cruising site within DC at the time. Tim gets recommended for a job by Hawk, sort of surprisingly, and gets the job, then gives a thank you gift to Hawk. They end up sleeping together, and then this sort of starts their romance. It sort of is an on and off again affair. They actually are kind of getting to know each other and are a little too familiar, shall we say, at the Christmas party, and then one of their co-workers overhears and then actually turns his name, Hawk's name, over to the miscellaneous M unit, and he gets interrogated by it. There's a whole very a scene where he does a lie detector test, and it's very interesting, but we won't talk much about that. Anyway, they break up, they get back together, and then eventually it doesn't work out. Tim wants a more traditional relationship, and Hawk sort of wants to be able to sleep with other people and do other things. So in the end, it doesn't work out for them, and they end up leaving in DuPont Circle at the end, sort of a full circle moment there. So let's take a look at Tim's character. He's, like I said, shy, and this is reflected in his vocal writing with the use of staccatos. So this is when he goes to Hawk's office to deliver the thank you gift, and we hear a little bit of that in his writing here. So just a little taste there. The main heavy lifting of his characterization, it happens in his last night aria, or at least what I want to share with you from the opera is. So this really shows his back and forth struggle. He's a Catholic, he thinks that being gay is wrong, but he's also fallen in love with Hawk, and those kind of reconciling those two things. It's very interesting how that happens musically throughout this aria. We will listen to the whole aria because I think it's important to kind of get a larger musical context for it. But this is the basic structural breakdown. We have the A section, we're in E flat major, and we have these sort of two chords that we're sort of rocking between. There's a very straightforward E flat major chord, and then an F chord with an added sixth and ninth, but no third. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there as it kind of undulates back and forth. We are accented with a few ascending major second sequences, which I'm calling the victory theme, under certain phrases that kind of give the indication that maybe Tim is leaning in the direction of accepting his relationship. So things like, how did he know that I am his? How many more nights will I spend in his arms? How soon will I see him again? And with that lift of the ascending seconds, it kind of gives a positive spin on those thoughts. Then we come back with some doubt, and that's the B section. So in the B section, we get him saying, well, it's a mortal sin, and I could go to hell. All of these things that are bad in the world are caused by mortal sins, earthquakes, and whatnot. And musically, that sort of is mirrored. At the end, however, as he's going back and forth, he says, well, but is it really wrong? I think it was right. It was right last night when we were together. And at that point, we get a return to the A section, kind of underscoring that maybe again we're leaning towards his commitment to the relationship. And we see that through the key change here into C Lydian as well. We'll see when I talk about Hawke's character a little bit later that there's a raised fourth association with his character as well. So the Lydian gives us a little bit more of Hawke's influence on Tim's character. And then we also see, in addition, now the undulating chords, that second chord, we actually do get the third, and it ends up being a major third in there. So now in the new key, that becomes D major chord with the added sixth and ninth. So there's a little bit more firm confirmation there, as well as more virtuosic vocal writing, and that F sharp that was missing in that chord for the D is also very prominent in the vocal line. He keeps coming back to that F sharp. So it's a very kind of clever way for Gregory Spears to kind of show within this aria that now Tim actually is really committing to this relationship. And although he's conflicted, he's, at least in his heart, decided that he's going to try to pursue it. Then finally, we just have a coda here in G that has some cross relations kind of underpinning this sense that maybe there's trouble to come. Maybe it won't end happily for the couple. So here's a little bit of the vocal line from the A prime section that I mentioned, really outlining D and often falling on that F sharp. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and listen. So the aria happens, I should mention, this is after they sleep together for the first time. Then he goes to St. Peter's Church to repent. So we see him kneeling. These are just clips from a few different performances that have happened. So let's take a listen.
How many was only us. It was only right. It was right last night.
Bigger orchestration. We're also going to end on a Lydian cluster, which again is a nod to Hawk's influence over him. Okay, so very, very dynamic aria. A lot of tenors have actually pulled this piece out as kind of a set piece that they have performed in different recitals, just because it really showcases the voice well and the dramatic quality of his character. So, while we still have a little time, Hawkins Fuller, the other love interest. So, like I mentioned just a second ago, there's an association with his entrances and this raised fourth scale degree. And I think this sort of mirrors his facade and his ability to kind of pull people towards his own tonal center and away from what they're maybe what roots them, right? So this is when he is going to see Tim at his apartment after he's gotten the job, and this is right before they first sleep together. Skippy is his pet, one of his pet names for Tim. So we're gonna hear the raised fourth in the bass here, with the E sharp in our B major signature.
I ask thee, what's for dinner? Chicken soup.
So subtle there, but it's something that does seem that's pervasive throughout the score. Every time he comes on stage, we get that raised fourth. So a little bit about what the composer Gregory Spears said himself about his characterization of Hawk. He said, "For me, Hawk has a little troubadour music in him. If you listen to old troubadour music, it's very florid, and it's all about forbidden love. It's all about singing about something. What I like about it with Hawk is he's always trying to cover things up, and he always wants to be in control, and he's always showing off." So I think we see that most quintessentially in his aria, Our Very Own Home, which happens in Act 2. This is essentially when they've rekindled their relationship. They've gotten back together after they broke up, and Tim actually joined the military to try to get away from him for a little while. In the meantime, Hawk got married, and so while they are in their sort of love nest, the brick house, they're kind of talking, and Tim finds out that Hawk and his wife had vacationed in Bermuda, gets offended because their first aria together was called Bermuda because they were kind of talking about how they wanted to vacation there together, so he really feels betrayed. Tim storms out, and then Hawkins sings this aria to the empty house, kind of realizing that this is too much for Tim and they're going to have to end the relationship. Now, Hawk is kind of distracting himself while he's singing this. He's very good at distracting other people and getting other people to see what he wants them to see, and I think this aria sort of shows that he actually, in this context, has to do it to himself. So he does have these troubadour, ornate vocal lines with melismas, but it's even more so in this song. And I think partially that's because he's really trying hard to convince himself that, oh, I don't want this relationship. Now, because he has such a control kind of based mentality, he doesn't want to allow himself to actually want something that he can't have. So he's trying to convince himself that he doesn't want it anymore. And we can really see this disconnect in the use of the orchestra. So several places throughout the opera, the orchestra is used to kind of undercut what you think is happening or what the lyrics are saying. And this is a great example. So in this one, the orchestra is kind of slowly pulsing along with this sort of 6/4 feel, out of time with the vocal line. And Hawk is singing in sort of this very florid 4/4 in D major with increasing melismatic quality. So the end result is that we sort of feel these two worlds kind of floating side by side. And I think musically that's really showing that Hawk is deciding, well, even if I do want this relationship, because the society that I live in right now will not allow it, I have to force myself not to want it. And there's a little bit of a mental break. So we'll just hear a little bit of the beginning of this aria. Just a little taste that goes on. But with the last minute or so, I just want to kind of give a little understanding of the scope of what kind of has happened with the opera and a nod to its success. And I think that really shows how powerful these musical characterizations are. So it's had, it was premiered in 2016 with Cincinnati Opera and has had 11 productions in opera houses all around the country. You can see several of them there. And it also has an upcoming European premiere by the University College Opera. It was actually supposed to be presented at Lincoln Center next year, but the composer actually pulled the performance given the administration and everything that's been going on. Doesn't want to support that, so he's pulled the opera, so it will not be performed, but it was scheduled to be performed at the Kennedy Center next year. Also, the popularity of the book and the story, there has been a popular Showtime miniseries, maybe some of you have seen it, Fellow Travelers, that featured Matt Bomer and Jonathan Bailey. And of course, Jonathan Bailey is really blowing up now with Wicked. He's Fiyero in that, and obviously from Bridgerton before that. But interesting miniseries, definitely does not follow the plot line of the book very closely at all. We can talk more about that too if you want. But unlike the opera, which the opera does very closely follow the book. So I would encourage you to check out my dissertation. Obviously there's way more things that I would like to say. I'll maybe have to break this up into a few more paper talks to talk about some of those things. But if you are interested in reading it, you can scan this QR code and you can download my dissertation for free. It's on my university, the University of Illinois, where I got my degree, their website. Or you can just email me if you would rather communicate that way. I'm happy to answer a question or two now, or we can talk later. But that's where I'm going to end the talk. So, do you have any questions? Yeah.
Your analysis of opera kind of reminds me of something, which is perhaps a very commonplace thing to remember, but I'm thinking about Susan McClary's Feminine Endings, her analysis of opera. Are you familiar with that?
Susan McClary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it is the chapter Frame and Excess, how she argues that women were represented as being mad. And chromaticism was the mad part, and they used some frame of diatonic harmony to control their madness, still trying to portray it. And I thought that was very interesting, and my question would be, is there any musical way of representation, representing queerness in opera or in this opera in relation to other types of production? Like, is there any musical device that is used to portray queerness specifically? The way that it was used to portray femininity, or...
So in this particular opera, I think that the approach that Spears had was more that he's looking at individual characters and he's looking at their specific psyche, their specific story, and wasn't trying to make more broad things about, you know, like this kind of music is queer or this kind of music isn't queer, but more what fits that character. And it's specifically telling a queer story in this context, but all of the musical aspects are feeding the character more so than some kind of generalized sense of what being queer is, because it's a very personal thing. Something that I thought was very interesting, maybe this somewhat answers your question, somewhat doesn't, but there's also a really interesting aspect of how musical repetition comes into this piece, where he takes music that happens at one event in a character's life and then brings it back in another context that sort of is very different. And so you get a sense that there's a connection to that music, and you're kind of saying, well, what does that mean? So for instance, there's music that it seems kind of innocuous when it first happens, but it's like when Tim is very excited, he's writing a letter to his cousin Francie about how he's excited about his relationship with Hawk. And that sort of very, very fresh kind of emotions of a relationship, that hopefulness, right? And that music actually comes back when we get their correspondence, so Tim goes away, he's trying to distance himself from Hawk, and he joins the military and does all these things, says, I'm never gonna contact him again. Well, then something happens and he ends up writing him letters. And we get some of that music that returns when he's doing his correspondence. And I think what it's showing is that actually Tim hasn't grown psychologically. He's kind of putting himself back in that place where he was when he was hoping for that relationship at the beginning. And so then again, he's let down later. So there's all these kind of like really interesting Easter egg kind of repetitions, some more obvious, some less obvious, that give us clues into what characters are actually thinking about when they're doing different things in the opera. So that's one way that that Gregory Spears approached their characterizations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but Susan McClary has a lot of really interesting things to say, and it would be fun to talk more about that as well. Are there more questions? Okay, well, thank you. Appreciate it. We're excited if you're interested.